This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with Iranian-American artist YZ Kami. Kami has gained notoriety over the last 4 decades with his large-scale portraits of faces in contemplation, as well as a variety of other bodies of work which explore themes related to spirituality and the architecture of sacred spaces through both figuration and abstraction. In the conversation, we discuss the commonalities in his diverse body of work and what can be seen at his latest exhibition in New York. And now, a conversation about the night and day with artist YZ Kami. YZ Kami, thank you so much for joining me today on the Art Sense podcast. Kami, normally I like to start with artists with a hypothetical, which is, let's say you're sitting down at a dinner party next to someone who has no idea who you are or what your work looks like. How do you start to describe your work to a stranger?
Yes. First of all, I would say that I'm a painter and I've been painting since I was a child. So that has been, the center of my life ever since I was a young boy. And the main center of my work, if I'm asked by that guest at the dinner table that what do you paint, my first answer is that I paint portraits. And but as you know, I paint also the other things. But portraiture and human being face has been the center of my work ever since I remember. And my mother was a painter, and I grew up where I grew up in Tehran was there was always her studio, and she was more of like a academic, like sort of portraiture, still lifes, and landscape paintings. Very academic, but very well done. And anyhow, I started to paint, and from very early on, I would say 5, 6, 7 years old. And I have already said that the reason I wanted to paint was to be able to paint human face. So human face was always the center of my interest in art, and I mean in painting. And this is how I started, and I continue. But then the other things started to develop also along the way.
For a lot of people that think of your work, one of the things that first comes to mind is scale, right? The scale of your portraits aren't exactly the scale of the portraits that your mother would have been painting back in Tehran, correct?
Yes. For years, my portraits were the size of like human head or a little smaller. I can say from childhood till I came to United States in the 80s, they were small paintings. And I always used a sitter in front of me in order to paint her or his portrait. And when I came to America in the 80s, although I had seen already very large portraits in churches, in Byzantine churches, I mean, in Hagia Sophia or in Torcello, those huge frescoes or mosaics of, saints and Jesus and Mary. Anyhow, but when I came to New York, I saw for the first time very large portraits done by contemporary artists. And the first one that I was stunned by was when I went to Metropolitan Museum in New York, and I saw the portrait of Mao by Andy Warhol, which is a huge painting. It's not there anymore for many years. I mean, it's back probably to the collector of the work. So that was my first encounter with a very large portrait in contemporary art. And I got very taken by that. And I decided to try to paint in my own way and my own style, but in a different size, in a much larger proportions. So then I realized that it's not possible to use a sitter. It's, a small face in front of you sitting there, and then this huge canvas of like 8 feet tall is impossible. So then that is when I started to use photography, meaning to have the picture of a head in front of me looking at, and trying to, first draw it and then trying to paint it. And it was marvelous. It was such a how would you say, liberation and freedom, because then I started to take like large brushes instead of those very small brushes. I could have like larger gestures, I mean, to paint the face. I mean, not like de Kooning gestures, but much freer than what I used to do in those small, meticulous portraits. And this was like a huge freedom that happened. And then ever since, I use these large formats, but also actually the show that you mentioned that is going to open at Gagosian next week, the portraits are not, there are 2 series of work in that exhibition. One is like some portraits, and one is a number of those night paintings, but the portraits are not very, very large. I mean, they're much larger than human size, but are not like 8 feet high or 10 feet high. And anyhow, that's how it happened that I, enlarged the size of the canvas. And but then I went back to also smaller scales during all these years. So after that experience, even the smaller scales became different. There was something that liberated in the process that was very, very interesting for myself.
I've heard you speak about inspiration that you drew from Roman Fayum mummy portraits. And I know that your large-scale portraits, originally, the eyes were looking straight ahead, like to kind of engage the viewer. But more commonly now, the eyes are not directly interacting with the viewer. The eyes are, many times looking down. Can you kind of talk about how that has evolved in your work over the years?
Yes, for many years I used to ask the sitter to look at me while I was painting him or her. And then, as you mentioned, when I was a student in Paris, I discovered the Fayum portraits, those Roman Egyptian 2nd, 3rd century portraits that the Louvre, the Museum Louvre, has a fabulous collection of those. And when I encountered those portraits, it was like a fantastic revelation. It was all these stylized, huge eyes looking at you, and they were painted to be later put on the sarcophage and on the mummy of the person, and those were really had a huge impact on me, and accentuated this desire to have the eyes staring at you and become like the absolute focus of the painting. But something happened that something around 20 years ago, I would say like somewhere 2003, 2005, I started to ask the sitter to have to have either eyes closed or the gaze down, that can convey a sense of meditation or contemplation or like introspection. And that was very interesting because it changed a lot. Before that, the eyes were always the focus, and I started the painting with the eyes, and I spent as much as time I could on the eyes, and then gradually I expanded to the rest of the face and the painting. But with eyes closed, that goes away. That window is closed, and then the whole surface of the face becomes, the focal point of your attention. And to paint was a different experience. And at the same time that the gaze went down in the paintings, in the faces, the painting started to become, that happened very naturally, started to become a little soft and blurry. The edges became a bit blurry, as if there is like a tremor or a movement on the surface of the painting. And then ever since now, ever since I've been painting both faces with closed eye and the gaze down, and also gazes at you, like in this exhibition. They are both.
You have invited me to come have this conversation in your studio, and I'm really sorry that the schedule just didn't allow me to be there to see the work in person. But my understanding from looking at the work, it looks like many times you're working on top of like a terracotta colored ground, right? Which reminds me a lot of how icon painters would go through the process of making icons. There would be this terracotta colored bole that would be under the gold leaf, right? And, I just wonder if that's just a coincidence that these images that kind of communicate, obviously icons communicate like a call to worship, but, there is a level of spirituality that's being conveyed in your work. Is it just a coincidence that you happen to also be working on a similar ground?
No, it's not a coincidence. To use terracotta as a ground is it was used a lot in Byzantine icons and medieval icons, but also in classic European paintings, like you have portraits, for instance, unfinished portraits of Goya. There are some that you can see that the background is terracotta. It's something that has been used in since Renaissance in different part of Europe as a background. And I tried it many years ago, and it suited me a lot. So for the gray became like more warmer or something like that. But then for the past few years, actually, I abandoned terracotta to gray background, like a um, medium gray. So the paintings you will see at this exhibition at Gagosian, the background to paint on is I prepared a certain tonality of gray.
In those paintings where you were using the terracotta as a ground, it's almost like you were leaving a hint of that across the bottom on many of those paintings. And I believe there was one. I believe it was the particular sitter was named Isaac, where it's almost like you left all of that terracotta exposed. And I believe that same model shows up in your new show, but in full color. I think is it Isaac in purple shirt?
Yes, correct. That's absolutely true. I did in Isaac. That also was just happened. The background was terracotta that I painted on, but then I started to paint the face on it. And then I decided that I thought it looks nice to keep the terracotta, and the whole rest of the painting is that terracotta. And in these new paintings, this new show, there is one portrait of a woman in a dark sweater that the background is also very intense terracotta. But that terracotta I painted over a gray, but, as opposed to Isaac, that the face of Isaac was painted on top of the terracotta background.
Well, it makes me think, from your perspective as an artist who's had a great deal of success in notoriety, it seems to me that you don't confine yourself to some set of rules. I mean, I feel like some artists could say, well, this is the recipe, this is the process that I've always used, and an artist can wind up being confined by their own success. But it seems like you have made a lot of room in your practice for experimentation and breaking your own rules. Would you agree?
Yes, I do. That has always been the case. And, because I do not follow, I mean, there are some basic technical matters that I've developed through years and through my practice, but I do not follow a program or a formula. I always say the image comes to me, and then I follow the image, or the emotion that comes, I follow it. That's why you see so different aspects in my work that you mentioned, like you have all the portraits, but you have also these years of those like geometric, abstract geometric, architectural, works of domes and collages and endless prayers. And then for the past several years, these paintings that I call them night paintings that are basically abstract. And yes, I don't think experimentation is not that I decide to experiment different things, is rather to follow things that they come to me.
That being said, how did you arrive at the night paintings? Was it purely an experience with indigo and wanting to play more with it, or what was the catalyst that had those paintings come about?
Around like probably 8 years ago, I was reading William Blake poetry again after many years, after my student years, and some images, some imagery was keep on coming to me that were not at all, or I didn't think it were connected to Blake's poems, nor to his visual work that had nothing to do. And so these images, sort of abstract with light and darkness, and they keep coming to me. And for a while, I just ignored them because they had nothing to do with my work, nothing to do with my portraits, nor with my abstract work, like Dome series and those things. And then after a while, I started to make sketches and of them. And then I started to use those sketches, and then in Photoshop, with the help of someone who's knowledgeable in Photoshop, to make them more concrete in using technology. And then started to print what happened in those. And then I started to make paintings. And I used that also very instinctively. I used the indigo and the color indigo, oil color of indigo. And they're all painted only with indigo and white, obviously. So you have the different shade of indigo. Some are areas that are very, very dark. You almost think they're black. And some are lighter blue. And then I read actually somewhere that indigo is considered as the color of the night in a moonless sky. And then I decided to call them night paintings, although they're all painted during the day, but they're night paintings, and they're abstract, and is not about night, is a mental state, is an inner state. I cannot describe which kind of inner state is that, but is these movements and these forms that they appear and then they dissolve, and yes, is a mental night, but night not in a dark sense, because there is also lots of light in these paintings.
Are there any domes or endless prayer works as part of this show that's coming up at Gagosian?
No, there isn't. But there is one portrait of an Asian-American man, a young man, he's in front of a black dome. I mean, that you see, as a background. His background is just part of a dome, you see, but his background is a black dome.
So is that the first time you've kind of combined those two bodies of work?
Yes. A portrait in front of a dome is the first time I've done that, yes.
Wow, that's really interesting. Just this week, I had a conversation with a guest from my podcast who wrote a book about the language of symbols in art and art history. And I always find it very interesting, the kind of the universal symbol, the kind of the collective unconscious worldwide that we kind of associate with circles and concentric circles, how it's, in many cases, it's tied to the heavens, whereas a square is kind of tied to the earth. And it's across all of these different cultures, across different religions, whether it's, Buddhists, thinking of circumambulating stupas or whatever. These abstract works, I mean, they do kind of have an underpinning of spirituality to them, correct?
Well, yes, absolutely. You know, the circles, concentric circles, and my dome and endless prayer paintings and collages, you know, these are very basic mandalas. Uh, and mandalas are, as you said, they're universal. You find them in Asia, you find them in Middle East, in Europe, in, you know, South America, are very primordial, basic image of the soul. I don't know how you call it, which word to use, that are universal. And my dome series, I think they are very simplified mandalas, but they refer to domes. The origin of it comes from the very first time that I did that was a photographic work that of two domes of two different mausoleums in Iran. One has the center is open so you can see light, and one is totally dark, the center. So I did two very large, like 10 feet by 9 feet works. I cut the photographs in pieces and I mounted them on canvas. And it was only showed once, was in an exhibition, was at an exhibition at MoMA, Museum of Modern Art, New York, called Architecture as Metaphor. And it's called Untitled Diptych. And they're like, it's a diptych that is for a corner. So they are, when you see them, you see both of them in an angle. And one is light at the center, one is darkness. And this is the very first time I use this circular imagery, and comes from architecture. And dome is like a symbol of the, you know, of heavens, because that's like the ceiling of the temple or the ceiling of the church or the whatever. And but my domes, I mean, the domes paintings are actually not domes in the actual sense, because the domes, they have a perspective. You know, the center of the dome is far from you inside the cupola, and then gradually the elements, the mosaics or the bricks, they become larger and larger. But in the dome paintings, they are all the same size, from the center till the edge of the canvas or the edge of the paper. Is the circles are all the same size, and the elements, meaning the bricks or the mosaics painted, are the same size. That gives the idea of you know, the infinity. This could go on and on to infinite. There's no structure to, you know, perspective that it stops. So that is used in also by collage, by cutting. I use also by cutting pieces of paper, written prayers or poetry in different languages, in Persian, in Hebrew, in Arabic, in Sanskrit, and then make these mandalas, very simple mandalas, that I call them endless prayers. The origin of it for me was that photographic work that I mentioned to you. And then after that, I did a sculpture called Rumi, the Book of Shams Tabrizi, which is out of soapstone, again, circles and concentric circles of soapstone. These were origin of this series. And then I did, you know, collages, and I continue to make those paintings of domes in white, or some of them I use gold leaf, some of them are blue.
So the endless prayers are collage comprised of text printed on rice paper, but your collage work also includes projects that you've used photography, whether that's of a particular place, architecture, maybe even including a person. Can you talk a little bit about your photo collages?
Architecture I've always been very interested in architecture. And as a teenager growing up in Iran, I traveled there with my parents, I saw some, old architecture that I was very taken by. Also, the Byzantine and some medieval architectures in Europe that I've seen also during that time, and was a very I always felt very connected with the space, and specifically the sacred architecture in different traditions. And so the photographic work of architecture and space had started in the 90s, while I was also painting portraits. And they all dealt with very simple images of, like bricks. This, I mentioned to you that ceilings, or, just walls. And again, very simplified architectural facades, but all mostly connected to sacred architecture.
A couple months ago, I had Shirin Neshat on the podcast, and it was very interesting to talk to her about her journey being an Iranian in exile here, how her work has always kind of tried to process not only her own journey, but the state of women in Iran. And, it was interesting hearing that after being here for more than 40 years, she's beginning to kind of come into her own identity as an Iranian-American. Being someone who grew up one place and has lived for 40 years someplace else, I imagine you can identify with that. What has your journey been like in drawing inspiration from your culture, in trying to figure out what your identity is here in the U.S.?
I left Iran when I was 17 years old, and I was for like 10 years student in Paris. And then after that, in the 80s, mid 80s, I came to New York. And ever since, I live in New York, and New York, I call it home. I've been living here almost, 38 years. But the fact that I'm an Iranian and I grew up there was with me ever since. I mean, it never abandoned me. When I left in Iran in the mid-late 70s, I was reading my favorite Persian poets always, and that has never stopped. I was reading Hafez in the 80s, in the 70s, or Rumi, the 70s, early 80s, late 80s, 2000, last night. I mean, what I carry inside, meaning my visual experiences, my emotional experiences, meaning all my childhood and teenage years, and the culture that I grew up in, which was both Western and Eastern, because my family was also very exposed to the West, has always been with me. So I never felt that many people might feel that there was like a cut, because what I experienced growing up in Iran never left me. All my work comes from that, and also everything else that I was exposed to ever since.
There was one last piece that I wanted to ask you about, and you've made several of these, and that's called The Messenger.
Yes.
I think the interesting thing about The Messenger is that, we talked about your early portraits kind of engaging the viewer, looking into a viewer's eyes, and then the other body of them, they're looking down. The Messenger, we're seeing the back of this person, right? What is the inspiration behind The Messenger?
Is that comes from a picture that I took many years ago, probably 15 years ago or something, in a trip in southern India. Of someone was on a road and going away, and I could see only his back. I think it was a man. I took a picture, and that picture I kept it for years, and then I put it on the wall of my studio. And I always wanted to do something with it. And this is last year that I started to do the first painting of. I changed the environment and his garment somehow. The first one was a smaller painting. And the way when it was changed, the landscape looked more like it could be Africa, or it could be also South Asia, or Southeast Asia, and the figure is going towards that landscape, and between the landscape and the figure there is a road that there is a lot of light. These are things that I changed and I added to the image, full of light. So a friend of mine saw and said, "Oh, this is Dante. He's going towards that landscape, that forest." And then another friend thought this is going towards light. Anyhow, it's very mysterious. It's like I called it Messenger, and he has a stick. And if you ask me what is his message, this messenger, what is his message? I don't know. But again, a friend mentioned that this is messenger of love, and I like that.
But it strikes me that it's very open-ended in that there is the capability of people inserting their own narratives in there. Even for you, I mean, you know where that image was taken, but you've kind of created a scenario for it where it could be a Bedouin in North Africa, or it could be a Mahatma in India, or, a shepherd in Ethiopia, right? I mean, it's like...
Yes, absolutely. Or Eastern Africa. It is. It could be any of those places.
Kami, I believe if I have the dates right, the show is going to be up at Gagosian. The show is called Night and Day. And the show is going to be up January 17th to February 25th at Gagosian's West 24th Street location.
Exactly.
And this is your first solo show in New York in almost a decade, right?
The last time was January 2014. I had a show at Gagosian, a solo show at Gagosian on Madison Avenue, 980 Madison. This is my first solo exhibition in New York after 9 years, and actually is the very first time I'm showing in Chelsea, which I'm very excited about.
Kami, I really appreciate your time. And I really appreciate you being willing to talk about your work and explain all of the wonderful nuances and subtle references in your work. And I hope that this show goes quite well. And I really appreciate you making yourself available today.
I hope you will see the show.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to ArtSense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.